The Nazis trained their soldiers to fear enemy armies. No one trained them to fear teenage girls. What if the deadliest assassins in Nazi-occupied Europe weren't commandos, not spies in trench coats, but teenage girls? 13, 14, 15 years old. They rode bicycles through occupied streets, smiled at German officers, flirted in bars, and then led those men into the woods, where they never came back. This isn't a myth. This isn't propaganda. This is the true story of how 3 Dutch girls became the most feared killers the Nazis never saw coming. In the vast, brutal theater of the Second World War, the Nazi war machine seemed invincible. It was an army of millions, a force of steel and fire that crushed nations and redrew the map of Europe. Its soldiers were trained, disciplined, and backed by the most terrifying military-industrial complex the world had ever seen. But on the quiet, cobblestoned streets of Haarlem in the occupied Netherlands, the Third Reich found an enemy it could never have predicted. An enemy that didn't wear a uniform, command a tank, or carry a standard-issue rifle. This enemy's greatest weapon was its own perceived innocence. They weren't soldiers. They were girls, teenagers. And this trio, armed with little more than their bicycles, their courage, and a shocking willingness to do the unthinkable, would become a more insidious threat to high-ranking Nazi officers and their Dutch collaborators than a battalion of men. They didn't fight in the trenches. They fought in the shadows, in taverns, and on lonely forest paths. This is the incredible, harrowing, and almost unbelievable true story of how 3 young women became the Nazis' most unlikely and most feared assassins. Before the war, their world wasn't one of spies and sabotage. It was a world of school, family, and the simple rhythms of life in the Netherlands. In the city of Haarlem, the Oversteegen family was known for their strong convictions. Their mother, Truus, was a fiercely independent woman, raising her 2 daughters, Truus and Freddie, on her own. As a committed communist, she instilled in her girls a powerful sense of justice and a deep-seated hatred of fascism. For a time, they lived on a barge, and long before the war, their mother was already resisting intolerance, sheltering refugees from Lithuania, and later hiding a Jewish couple in their small apartment. The girls learned a crucial lesson from their mother's example. You don't look away from injustice. You stand up and confront it, no matter the personal risk. Truus, born in 1923, was the older sister, bold, decisive, and a natural leader. Freddie, born in 1925, was quieter but described as equally fierce, with an observant nature that would prove invaluable. Though they grew up in poverty, their childhood was rich in principle. They didn't just hear about the evils of fascism. They saw its human cost in the desperate faces of the people their mother gave sanctuary to. This was their first lesson in resistance, learned not in a classroom, but in the cramped quarters of their own home. Meanwhile, another young woman in Haarlem, Hannie Schaft, known to everyone as Hannie, was on a similar path. Born in 1920, her upbringing was different. Her father was a teacher, and her mother a devout Mennonite. Politics and justice were constant topics around their dinner table. Having lost their first daughter to diphtheria, Hannie's parents were deeply protective, but they couldn't shield her from the world. Bright and driven, she enrolled at the University of Amsterdam in 1938 to study law, dreaming of becoming a human rights lawyer. There, her friendships with Jewish students like Sonja Frank and Filine Polak deepened her understanding of the real human cost of the anti-Semitic hatred spreading from Germany. Then, on May 10, 1940, their world shattered. Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army fought back but was overwhelmed. After the horrific bombing of Rotterdam, the Netherlands surrendered and the occupation began. At the time, Truus Oversteegen was 16, Hannie Schaft was an 18-year-old university student, and Freddie Oversteegen was just 14. At first, life tried to go on, but a creeping dread soon took over as anti-Jewish laws were passed, stripping people of their rights, their businesses, and their dignity. For Hannie, seeing her Jewish friends targeted was a call to action. For the Oversteegen sisters, it was an unbearable cruelty. Freddie later recalled the terrifying sound of German soldiers banging on doors with their rifle butts in the middle of the night, their shouts echoing as they dragged neighbors from their homes. The abstract evil they'd been raised to despise was now a brutal daily reality. The time for simply holding beliefs was over. The time for action had arrived. The first acts of defiance were small, but they were a start, a way of shouting back into the silence. Truus and Freddie began by distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets and pasting posters around Haarlem, urging Dutch men not to work in Germany, which would only free up more German soldiers for the front. It was dangerous work. To be caught was to risk arrest, or worse. But for a 16- and a 14-year-old, it felt necessary. They were doing something. Their youthful bravery didn't go unnoticed. A man named Frans van der Wiel, commander of the Haarlem Council of Resistance, heard about the two fearless sisters. He saw their age and gender as a unique strategic advantage. Who would ever suspect two teenage girls on bicycles of being part of the underground? One day he showed up at their door. He got straight to the point. He was forming a resistance group focused on sabotage and armed resistance. He asked if they would be willing to join. Their mother, Trijan, let them make their own choice. When asked what they'd have to do, van der Wiel was blunt: sabotage bridges and railway lines. Truus later remembered Freddie's immediate, startling response. The girl who had never held a weapon piped up and asked if they would also learn to shoot Nazis, adding with startling frankness, "Well, that's something I've never done before." The decision was made. Their mother gave her blessing with one solemn instruction that would guide them through the darkness. Always stay human. It was a simple phrase, but it held enormous weight, a plea to remember their own humanity, even as they confronted the absolute inhumanity of their enemy. Meanwhile, Hannie Schaft was facing her own turning point. In 1943, the Nazis demanded all university students sign a declaration of allegiance. Hannie refused, along with most of her classmates, and was forced to end her studies. Her dream of becoming a human rights lawyer was cut short by a regime that despised human rights. She moved back home to Haarlem, bringing her two Jewish friends with her to go into hiding. Fueled by a burning sense of injustice, she sought a more active role and eventually made contact with the same group, the Haarlem Council of Resistance. This is when the trio was formed: the working-class sisters, Truus and Freddie, and the university student, Hannie. Each brought a unique strength. Truus, the decisive leader; Hannie, the sharp intellectual planner; and Freddie, the youngest, whose innocent appearance was the perfect camouflage. United by a common cause, these three young women were about to escalate their war against the occupiers. Their lives as ordinary girls were over. The transformation from distributing pamphlets to carrying out sabotage was shockingly swift. They learned to handle firearms in secret and were taught how to use dynamite to cripple the bridges and railway tracks that served as the arteries of the German war machine. Their bicycles, once used for errands, became their primary vehicles of war. The baskets on the front, perfect for holding groceries, now concealed pistols and explosives. Their mission started with sabotage and smuggling Jewish children to safety, sometimes spiriting them away from detention facilities just before they could be sent to concentration camps. This was the heart of their mother's plea to stay human. Every child they saved was a life-affirming act of defiance. But the resistance needed to strike back directly at the architects of this cruelty, the high-ranking Nazi officers and the hated Dutch collaborators. The group needed assassins, and the resistance decided to use its most secret weapons. The psychological leap from saving a life to taking one is immense, but as an author who knew the sisters later explained, they believed it simply had to be done. They couldn't arrest these men. The entire system was controlled by the Nazis, so they became judge, jury, and executioner. Freddie, the youngest, was the first of the three to kill. The method was audacious. She'd ride her bicycle past a target, pull out a gun, shoot him, and keep pedaling. A drive-by shooting by a girl who looked like she wouldn't harm a fly. As Truus later explained, "We always went by bike, never walked, that was too dangerous." No one ever suspected them. Then came the tactic for which they would become most feared: seduction. They would go to bars frequented by high-ranking Nazi officers and collaborators. Using their youth and charm, they'd strike up a conversation, flirt, and suggest going for a stroll in the nearby woods. The officer, believing he was about to have a romantic encounter, would willingly follow. Then, in the darkness of a lonely forest path, the trap was sprung. Sometimes another resistance member was waiting, other times the girls did it themselves. The man who walked into the woods never walked out. It was brutally effective, but the emotional toll was immense. It was tragic and very difficult, and we cried about it afterwards, Truus later confessed. We did not feel it suited us. It never suits anybody, unless they are real criminals. One loses everything. It poisons the beautiful things in life. They were young women forced by monstrous circumstances to do monstrous things. They wrestled with the morality of it all, even refusing an order to kidnap the children of a Nazi official because they would not harm children, a line they refused to cross as part of their struggle to remain human. Their actions sowed fear and paranoia. A German officer could no longer feel safe. The pretty girl smiling at him from across the bar might not be an admirer, she might be his executioner. That uncertainty was a powerful weapon. But it also came at a terrible price. For every successful assassination, the Nazis often carried out brutal reprisals, executing innocent civilians. The girls knew their actions could lead to the deaths of the very people they were trying to protect, a burden they carried for the rest of their lives. Of the three, it was Hannie Schaft who became the most notorious to the Nazis. Her intelligence and icy composure made her exceptionally effective, but it was a simple physical trait that made her a legend, her fiery red hair. As word of a deadly female operative spread, she became known simply as the girl with the red hair, das Mädchen mit dem roten Haar. This nickname turned her into both a resistance icon and a high-priority target for the Gestapo. Her name was placed on their most wanted list, and it was even reported that Adolf Hitler himself personally ordered her capture. To continue her work, she dyed her hair black and started wearing large glasses. For a time, it worked. She and Truus often went on missions together, with Truus sometimes disguised as a man, so they could pass as a couple and avoid suspicion. The bond between the three was forged in shared danger and absolute trust. They were sisters in arms. But the constant violence and threat of death took a heavy toll, especially on Hannie, who suffered from what we would now call depression and PTSD. She was haunted by her actions, but driven to continue by her unshakable sense of justice. As the war dragged on into 1945, liberation felt tantalizingly close, yet the cornered Nazi regime grew even more brutal. The resistance kept fighting. On March 21, 1945, Hannie was on her bicycle, on her way to deliver underground newspapers, when her luck ran out. She was stopped at a German military checkpoint. During the search, soldiers found the illegal papers and a pistol. She was arrested. At first, her captors didn't realize who they had, but then they noticed her hair, dyed black, was starting to grow out. At the roots, they could see the unmistakable color, red. They had finally caught the girl with the red hair. She was interrogated and tortured, but refused to give up any information on her comrades. Near the end of the war, an agreement was made between the occupying forces and the Dutch resistance to halt all executions. But the local Nazi commanders, infuriated by Hannie, decided to ignore the order. On April 17, 1945, just 3 weeks before the liberation of the Netherlands, Hannie Schaft was taken from her cell and driven to the dunes outside Overveen, a notorious execution ground. She was forced to the edge of a shallow grave. According to the story that became a national legend, the first shot only grazed her. Looking at her executioner, the 24-year-old uttered her defiant final words, "I am a much better shot." A second officer then opened fire, and she fell. The war in the Netherlands would be over in 18 days. When the war finally ended, the Netherlands celebrated. But for Truus and Freddie Oversteegen, the war never truly finished. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of what they had done, seen and lost would reverberate for the rest of their lives. They had survived, but their friend Hannie had not. Her death, so close to the end, was a devastating blow. After the war, her body was found in a mass grave in the dunes. Of the 422 resistance members discovered there, 421 were men. She was the only woman. Hannie Schaft was reburied with full honors and became a national hero, an icon of Dutch resistance. For the survivors, the path forward was complicated. There were no parades for assassins. Both sisters suffered from what would now be identified as severe PTSD, enduring nightmares and intrusive memories of their violent past. They had fought to stay human, but the fight left deep, invisible wounds. The sisters coped with their trauma in different ways. Truus became the public face of their story, finding an outlet in art and speaking about the war and the importance of tolerance. She was instrumental in establishing the National Hannie Schaft Foundation to preserve her friend's legacy. Freddie, on the other hand, retreated from the public eye. She married, had 3 children, and tried to build the quiet, normal life she had fought for. For decades, she rarely spoke of the girl who once dispensed death from the back of a bicycle. Her son later said that in her mind, the war never stopped. For many years, their specific contributions were not widely celebrated. The image of teenage girls as killers was a difficult truth for society to process. But over time, their story began to emerge. In 2014, nearly 70 years after the war, the Dutch Prime Minister officially recognized their incredible bravery, awarding both Truus and Freddie the Mobilization War Cross. Streets in Haarlem were named in their honor, cementing their place in history. Their story has since been told in books like Sophie Polderman's Seducing and Killing Nazis and Tim Brady's 3 Ordinary Girls, ensuring their legacy endures. Poldermans, who knew the sisters personally, helped bring their deeply personal struggles to a global audience. Truus Oversteegen passed away in 2016 at 92, and Freddie Oversteegen died in 2018, the day before her 93rd birthday. The story of Hannie Schaft, Truus Oversteegen, and Freddie Oversteegen is more than just a shocking tale of war. It's a profound and unsettling look at courage, resistance, and the brutal choices forced upon ordinary people. They weren't born killers, they were forged into them by occupation and injustice. They were 3 girls who saw their world consumed by a monstrous evil and refused to stand by and watch. They fought back with the only weapons they had, their wits, their bicycles, their perceived innocence, and finally, their guns. They were told to always stay human, and in their own way, they did. They cried after missions. They refused to harm children. They wrestled with the poison of their actions for the rest of their lives. Their story forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What's the true measure of danger? The Nazis had an army of millions, but were terrified of one girl with red hair. They had tanks and planes, but were vulnerable to 2 sisters on a bicycle. Hannie, Truus, and Freddie proved that sometimes the most dangerous force in a conflict isn't an army, but a few determined individuals who refuse to be broken and are willing to sacrifice everything for what they believe is right. The story of these 3 young women is one of many incredible tales of resistance from World War II that often go untold. If you found their story as compelling as we did, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories, and let us know in the comments below, what does their story teach us about the nature of courage? We look forward to reading your thoughts. Thank you for watching.